Imagine the coldest winter night of your life. You wrap yourself in a blanket, turn on the heater, and go to sleep. Now imagine there's no heater, no windows, and it's 20 degrees below zero outside. In the Middle Ages, winter wasn't just a season, it was a merciless killer. You have no central heating or convenient gas stove. Your life literally depends on a single pile of burning branches on the earthen floor. Losing that flame meant losing your chance to survive until spring. Today we take warmth for granted, but back then it was a daily struggle. Does that sound like an exaggeration for dramatic effect? Not at all, because the survival of entire villages hinged on a single bonfire. This sole source of heat dictated when people slept, what they ate, and who they lived with. And this is where the real story begins. For us, modern winter is a time for sweaters, hot coffee, and holiday movies. For a medieval peasant, November marked the start of a 4-month struggle for every breath. Temperatures dropped, the ground froze, and daylight hours shrank to a pitiful few hours. It wasn't just discomfort, it was a full-scale siege by nature. Today we complain if the utility company turns off the heat for a couple of hours. In the 13th century, people had neither utility companies, nor radiators, nor any hope of outside help. Their only salvation was fire, which had to be kept burning at all costs. And this is not a metaphor, but a harsh physical reality. Most houses of that time were built of wood, clay, and straw. These walls protected against the wind, but barely kept the heat inside. If the temperature outside was below freezing, it was only slightly higher inside. Without a constant source of heat, a person would simply freeze to death in their sleep. You could put on every piece of clothing you own, but it wasn't enough. Fabrics were coarse, and real woolen clothing cost a fortune. Peasants slept in the same clothes they worked in during the day. Therefore, an external heat source was critical for survival. And that's where the concept of the communal hearth comes in. It wasn't a fancy fireplace from British TV shows about aristocrats. It was simply a pit lined with stones right in the middle of the house's only room. The entire life of the family in the village revolved around this primitive circle. Think about this from the perspective of modern logic. We're used to dividing space into a bedroom, kitchen, and living room. Back then, the whole family huddled in a single room around the fire. Going to the far corner of the room meant voluntarily stepping into a freezer. The heat from the fire spread only a couple of meters around it. Therefore, people slept practically right next to the fire, risking burns. But it was a calculated risk, because a burn was better than death from hypothermia. Life was literally measured by the distance to the burning coals. Modern scientists are amazed at how the human body adapted to such conditions. The cardiovascular system reorganized itself to conserve energy in conditions of constant cold. But even the best physiology needed external heating. Fire served as a kind of external battery for the human body. If this battery ran out, the consequences were catastrophic. In the Middle Ages, a cold often proved fatal due to the lack of antibiotics. Therefore, keeping the fire going was not a household chore, but a matter of national security at the level of a single hut. It sounds crazy, but it's true. Every twig gathered, every piece of peat, was worth its weight in gold. People spent the summer months not resting, but preparing for this winter ordeal. They knew that the coming cold would not forgive mistakes or laziness, and the main tool in this war was right in the center of their home. It seems logical to simply chop up as much firewood as possible and burn it all winter long. But here lies a huge historical misconception in our understanding of the past. Forests in the Middle Ages were not a free supermarket of building materials. Most forest lands belonged to lords, and cutting down trees there was a crime. For illegally cutting down a tree, you could be thrown into a dungeon or even executed. Peasants were allowed to collect only what had already fallen to the ground. This was called the right to gather dead wood, and there was a catastrophic shortage of it. Imagine having to heat your house all winter using only branches from the park. That's why firewood became an incredibly valuable resource in winter, often more valuable than food itself. You could go without dinner for several days, but without a fire, you'd freeze to death overnight. Every log was saved as if it were a bar of pure gold. The economics of firewood dictated the rules of survival for the entire village. Fires were stoked sparingly, just enough to keep from freezing to death. No one built huge blazing bonfires for comfort. The flames were kept at the bare minimum, teetering on the brink of dying out. It was like the power-saving mode on your smartphone. Only the stakes were life itself. To conserve fuel, people devised methods that were ingenious in their simplicity. They cooked only once a day to avoid wasting heat. Pots were placed directly in the embers, making the most of the residual heat. Modern chefs would call this slow simmering, but back then it was a harsh necessity. When there was almost no firewood left, anything that could burn was used. People burned dried manure, old straw, and even scraps of leather. The smell in the house was distinctive, but there was no choice. The heat from burning manure was no different from that of an oak log. During the harshest frosts, neighbors would pool their fuel supplies. Several families would gather in a single house to keep just one fire burning for everyone. The remaining huts stood empty and froze solid. It was a primitive but incredibly effective strategy of cooperation. Today we pay for heating with money, transferring it to the company's account. Medieval people paid for warmth with their back-breaking labor and constant fear. They counted down the days until spring, watching the pile of kindling in the corner melt away. This survival math was brutal and left no room for error. If a family miscalculated its supplies, the outcome was predictable. Getting dry firewood in January under a meter-thick layer of snow was practically impossible. That's why the gathering never stopped, even on the coldest days. People wandered through the snowdrifts in search of any dry branch, risking getting lost and freezing to death. It was precisely this total scarcity that gave rise to a culture of incredibly careful regard for fire. Losing the fire due to carelessness was considered not just foolishness, but a crime against one's family. The flame was guarded with religious reverence, because it was their local deity. Without it, darkness and inevitable doom would follow. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the smoke in the hut. In the early Middle Ages, there were simply no such things as nice brick chimneys. The fire burned right on the floor, and the smoke escaped through a hole in the thatched roof. And the key phrase here is, tried to escape. In reality, most of the acrid smoke remained inside the small room. It hung in a thick layer near the ceiling, sinking lower and lower as the air cooled. People literally lived, ate, and slept in a constant gray haze. Modern firefighters would call this an area with an unbreathable environment. Your eyes would water constantly, and a cough would become a chronic companion. Archaeologists often find traces of severe lung disease in the remains of medieval people. This was a direct result of inhaling combustion products every winter throughout their lives. Smoke was an invisible enemy that they endured for the sake of victory over the cold. Why didn't they just build proper chimneys? Because a wide flue lets out not only smoke, but also precious heat. The opening in the roof was kept as small as possible to keep the hot air inside the house. It was a cruel compromise between the ability to breathe and the ability to stay warm. To survive in this fume-filled environment, peasants slept right on the floor. Closer to the ground, the air remained relatively clean and breathable. If you stood up straight while the stove was burning, you would simply suffocate. Life took place at a height of 30 centimeters above the floor. Modern scientists are amazed at how the human body could withstand such toxic exposure. Carbon monoxide levels in these homes regularly exceeded all conceivable safety standards. Today, at such levels, alarms would go off and the building would be evacuated. Back then, people would simply roll over and go back to sleep. Over time, the walls and ceiling of the hut became covered with a thick layer of shiny black soot. Paradoxically, this coating served as additional insulation for the dwelling. The soot filled the cracks between the boards and straw, preventing the cold wind from penetrating inside. Even from toxic waste, medieval people derived practical benefits. They endured the poisoned air for one simple reason. The alternative was far worse. Death from the cold came within a few hours, while death from lung disease took decades. In conditions where life expectancy was already low, the choice was obvious. People chose to cough today so they could wake up tomorrow. People's clothes, hair, and skin were thoroughly saturated with the smell of an old fire. This pungent aroma was the hallmark of any commoner of that time. You could smell an approaching peasant long before you saw him, a peculiar medieval perfume with notes of despair and burnt pine. And yet, despite this daily gaseous hell, the hearth remained the center of attraction. Not only people gathered around it, but also pets, instinctively understanding the value of warmth. Any animal would gladly trade the crisp, frosty air for a spot by the smoky fire. And by the way, the animals in the house deserve a separate mention. In the modern world, pets in the home are cats on the couch and hamsters in a cage. Today, we keep them solely for pleasure and pleasant company. In the Middle Ages, the concept of pets had a far more radical and purely practical scope. Back then, people depended on their animals for their very survival. With the onset of the first severe frosts, peasants would bring their livestock inside their huts. Cows, pigs, and sheep became your full-fledged roommates for the coming months. It sounds like an unsanitary nightmare, and that's exactly what it was. Dirt and persistent odors were constant companions of this forced cohabitation. People had to put up with constant noise and cramped quarters in their own homes. But this solution, which seems crazy at first glance, had an ironclad logic based on the laws of physics. Surviving the winter required extremely unconventional approaches to heat conservation. Peasants used any available resources to heat their homes. A large animal like a full-grown cow constantly emits a huge amount of natural heat. The digestive process in herbivores generates additional energy continuously. Essentially, it was a walking biological battery weighing half a ton. It would have been unwise to let such a heat source freeze on the cold street. Villagers fully understood the value of every degree during the harsh season. Therefore, they tried to make the most of the warmth provided by their livestock. The heat from the animals' breath and massive bodies significantly raised the overall temperature in the small room. Even in the most bitter cold, the air inside warmed up quite quickly. Combined with the fire from the campfire, this created a powerful synergistic heating effect. Biological heat greatly amplified the output of scarce firewood, conserving precious fuel. In winter, every armful of wood saved significantly increased the chances of surviving until spring. People literally used their animals as furry heaters. Huts were often built as long houses, where people lived in one half and livestock in the other. This was the classic architecture for many northern regions of that time. The partition between them was symbolic or absent altogether to allow for free air circulation. The dense heat from the barn flowed completely unimpeded and smoothly into the living area. There, it naturally mixed with the hot air from the hearth. This ingenious engineering system worked without any electricity. Sleeping next to the animals was not only warm, but also relatively safe. The animals' bodies gave off a gentle, steady heat without the risk of fire. Unlike embers, a cow couldn't accidentally burn down your house with a flying spark. Fires were a terrible threat to the wooden and thatched structures of those days. Many peasants deliberately set up their sleeping places closer to the stalls. The smell of manure was a small price to pay for the chance to avoid shivering from the cold all night. Of course, such close quarters brought a host of associated health problems. Fleas, parasites, and infections spread freely from the animals to their owners. Dangerous diseases could easily be transmitted through the air in such a confined space. Modern medicine would be horrified by such close interspecies contact. Doctors would strictly forbid keeping livestock so close to children's sleeping quarters. Today, such conditions would be deemed completely unsuitable for normal life. But back then, no one could see germs, while the cold was all too real. Medical knowledge was simply insufficient to understand the causes of many common diseases. The threat of freezing to death terrified medieval people far more than any invisible illness. Moreover, the animals themselves desperately needed protection from the harsh winter elements. Livestock also suffered greatly from the biting, icy wind and heavy snowfalls. Owners were obligated to care for their animals for the common good. Leaving a single cow to freeze outside meant condemning the family to starvation. Without fresh milk, surviving the long winter was practically impossible. Animals were the most valuable asset, and they were cherished more than one's own children. Preserving the livestock was the main strategic goal of any peasant household. The loss of livestock was a financial disaster from which many could not recover. That is precisely why the animals were given the best and warmest spots in the house. Your dog, if you had one, slept right on top of you, acting as a living blanket. Faithful dogs kept their owners warm during the long, cold winter nights. Dogs have a higher body temperature than humans, making them ideal heat sources. The tradition of sleeping cuddled up with pets has existed among many northern peoples for centuries. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. They got a spot by the fire, and you got their warmth. No one lost out in this wise and practical symbiosis. When morning came, the animals weren't always sent out into the freezing street. Winter weather was often unpredictable and extremely dangerous for long walks. If the blizzard didn't let up, the shelter continued to operate in closed mode for days on end. People cleaned up after the livestock, fed them stored hay, and gave them melted water to drink. Then they returned to tending the fire and their routine household chores. Life came to a standstill, shrinking to the size of a single warm but incredibly stuffy space. For days on end, the peasants weathered the bad weather in the close company of their neighbors. Such a long winter required immense patience and mental endurance from everyone. There was simply no time for boredom, as the farm had to be constantly tended to. It was the only reliable way to survive the darkest months of the year. The entire village was buried in snow and turned into an archipelago of isolated islands of life. The main task was simply to wait for the first rays of the spring sun. Modern eco-homes use complex heat recovery systems and solar panels. Engineers invent smart thermostats and multi-layered synthetic materials. Medieval people achieved the same effect using a cow and a pile of firewood. Their approach is truly striking in its straightforwardness and ingenious simplicity of execution. It was a triumph of practicality over fastidiousness in extreme conditions, and the central bonfire remained the chief conductor of this zoo of survival. At night, the fire could not burn at full strength, as firewood had to be conserved. Gathering wood always took a tremendous amount of effort and time in the summer. In the winter, every extra foot of wood burned could result in a severe fuel shortage in the spring. Moreover, a bright open flame left unattended was a sure path to a fire. Leaving a fire burning in the middle of a wooden hut all night was pure madness. The risk of losing their only home kept people from such carelessness. Therefore, at night, the fire was put into a dormant state using an ancient and ingenious technique. It was passed down from generation to generation as the most vital knowledge. Modern survivalists still study this method of heat conservation in detail. It works flawlessly and requires no complicated tools. The key was to strictly follow the precise sequence of all necessary steps. Otherwise, you might wake up in a completely chilly room. Before going to sleep, the remaining hot coals were carefully raked into a tight pile in the center of the hearth. This was done with a long iron poker or a regular thick, unseasoned stick. It was important to gather every single red ember to preserve the precious heat. This hot pyramid became the heart of the sleeping house for the next few hours. Then the most critical stage of preserving the home fire began. The coals had to be properly insulated from the surrounding cool air. They were then generously covered with a thick layer of ash and gray cinders from previous fires. This useful material was always in abundance and was carefully stored right by the hearth. The ash acted as an ideal natural insulator, blocking the flow of excess oxygen. Without a supply of fresh air, active burning instantly slowed to a minimum. The fire gradually transitioned into a stage of deep and very slow smoldering. In this state, it could safely continue until dawn. This technique allowed the coals to remain hot for 8 or even 10 hours. Outwardly, the hearth looked completely extinguished and safe for the dwelling. But beneath a layer of inconspicuous gray ash, hidden energy continued to pulsate. Inside this mountain of ash, a true fiery beast slumbered patiently. In the morning, all one had to do was rake away the ash, place some dry kindling, and simply blow on it. The flame would burst into life in seconds, as if by magic, without the use of a flint or tinder. It sounds simple, but it was a real skill that required immense experience. A subtle understanding of the nature of fire was essential for every villager. It was incredibly easy to make a mistake in this complex task, even for an adult. If the coals were covered too tightly, the fire would suffocate and go out completely by morning. This meant having to start the very difficult process of kindling all over again, and doing so in a cold house was extremely unpleasant. If too much air was left, the coals would burn out quickly, and there wouldn't be enough heat to last the night. In that case, the family risked catching a serious cold due to the sharp drop in temperature. People sensed this delicate balance intuitively, learning the art of the hearth from early childhood. Children constantly observed the actions of their elders and absorbed their invaluable experience. Proper handling of the fire was the first survival lesson for any child. The safety of the entire clan depended directly on this skill. This method of preserving the fire was called smothering, or covering the hearth. The word itself derived from ancient terms meaning protection and care. In some countries, there was even a special clay cap with holes for this purpose. It covered the embers, shielding them from drafts and preventing dangerous sparks from flying. It was the medieval equivalent of a modern thermostat set to the minimum. Such a device made a good night's sleep much more peaceful. Using the embers solved two critically important survival tasks at once. First, it saved a tremendous amount of firewood during the night. Every log saved was worth its weight in gold during long cold spells. Second, the smoldering coals continued to give off steady, gentle heat throughout the night. This heat spread very slowly and evenly throughout the peasant hut. The house didn't freeze completely, and in the morning, people didn't have to wake up in an icy crypt. This routine process holds a profound symbolism of the continuity of human life. In this preserved form, the fire could burn in a single home for years and decades. Some families maintained a single hearth throughout the lives of several generations. Every night it was tucked in like a child, and every morning it was awakened to new life. The hearth became an immortal member of the family, requiring constant care and attention. Losing this sacred household fire was considered a very bad omen. Modern science fully confirms the incredible effectiveness of ash as an insulator. Its porous, loose structure excellently traps air between the tiniest particles. This creates a barrier against the escape of infrared radiation. Ancient people did not know the chemical composition of ash, but they brilliantly utilized its physical properties. They were practical engineers working with the materials that lay at their feet. Knowledge was acquired exclusively through trial and error. Starting a fire from scratch using flint in winter was an extremely difficult task. The metal would become covered in frost, and hands would quickly lose sensation from the intense cold. With frozen fingers, striking a spark on damp tinder could take hours without success. Therefore, preserving the embers was not merely a matter of convenience, but a matter of survival. Losing the heat meant exposing one's loved ones to a grave, life-threatening danger. Miscalculating the fire's protection meant facing the coldest and most terrifying morning of one's life. To prevent this from happening, the process of preparing the fire for the night was a strict ritual. This was usually handled by the oldest and most experienced member of the family, who understood the full weight of the responsibility. He knew exactly how much ash to add for the perfect result. No haste or carelessness was allowed when tomorrow's warmth was at stake. Every movement had been perfected through years of daily repetition. But even with all these precautions, sometimes extra insurance was needed. Leaving even a covered fire unattended all night was too risky. The wind could blow into the chimney and fan the sparks, or the coals could suddenly start to cool. Therefore, most families established a strict schedule of nightly shifts to keep the fire going. It was the most responsible job on which the lives of all the sleepers depended. Adult family members took turns every few hours throughout the night. The person on duty sat by the hearth, monitoring the temperature in the house and the state of the smoldering coals. If it got too cold, They would carefully lift the ashes and toss in small wood chips. The main task was to keep the flame from going out and prevent the hut from burning down. This is incredibly reminiscent of modern watch duties on submarines or military bases. Someone must always stay awake so that the others can rest safely. In the Middle Ages, this military discipline was practiced in every peasant hut every winter. Survival was a team sport, and there was no room for selfishness. Night shifts were exhausting, especially after a hard day of physical labor. A person would sit in the semi-darkness, fighting off sleep, listening to the howling wind outside the walls. Falling asleep on duty was considered a grave offense, for which one was severely punished within the family. To let one's loved ones down in such a matter was worse than stealing. To stay awake, those on duty engaged in small-scale manual work that didn't require bright light. They mended nets, knitted warm clothes, or carved wooden utensils by touch. This monotonous work helped keep the mind alert and prevented them from slipping into a dangerous drowsiness. Every minute of the night was used to the fullest benefit of the household. Night watches also had an important psychological aspect for the entire family. Knowing that someone was guarding your sleep and watching the fire provided a sense of security. In a world full of wild beasts and harsh elements, this vigilance restored the illusion of peace. The person with a stick by the fire was the main guarantor that tomorrow would come. When the shift ended, the watchman quietly woke the next family member on the schedule. A silent transfer of responsibility took place in the cold darkness of the hut. The new firekeeper took his place, while the previous one collapsed onto the sleeping platform, exhausted. This cycle repeated itself night after night throughout the long winter months. If there were elderly people in the household who could no longer perform hard labor during the day, they would take on the night shift. This restored their sense of significance and usefulness to their clan. The elders slept in short bursts during the day so they could become the primary defenders of the hearth at night. In this system, there were no useless people. Everyone contributed to survival. In modern films about the Middle Ages, we rarely see this exhausting routine. Usually the characters simply go to sleep and wake up alert and full of energy. In reality, their sleep was constantly interrupted, and sleep deprivation was a chronic condition throughout the winter. People walked around like zombies, expending their last reserves of strength to maintain this system. And all this complex choreography of watch duties, ashes, and animals served a single purpose: to wait for the saving dawn when the sun's rays would warm the frozen world, even if only a little. But sometimes the system failed, the watchman fell asleep, and the embers finally died out. And then the morning began with a real catastrophe. Dawn in a medieval village was rarely a romantic or pleasant event. It was a cold gray light seeping through the cracks, and the first question was always about the fire. The watchman would rake through the ashes with bated breath, hoping to see a saving red glow there. If the embers were still alive, the day began according to the familiar and safe routine. But if the fire had gone out completely overnight, the house was instantly plunged into panic. The air cooled within minutes, and the cold began to bite at the fingers and faces of the awakened people. Striking a fire with flint in the frost was far from always successful, especially if the tinder had gotten damp. Then there was only one option left: to seek help from the neighbors. Someone from the family would grab a special clay pot or an iron scoop and run outside. This was no friendly visit, but a sprint for survival through deep snow. They had to run to the nearest house, where the cherished smoke was rising from under the roof. Every second counted because freezing children were left behind in the unheated hut. Carrying burning coals from house to house was a standard medieval practice of mutual aid. Neighbors never refused such a request because tomorrow they themselves might find themselves in that same situation. They would scoop out a few of the brightest, hottest coals right from the center of someone else's hearth. You would take this borrowed life and run back, shielding the pot from the wind with your body. This process required incredible skill and caution during transport. The wind could blow the coals out or fan them into such a blaze that you would burn your hands to the bone. If you stumbled and dropped the pot in the snow, your home would be left without heat. You weren't just carrying hot stones, you were carrying your family's future for the day. Remember modern action movies where heroes race in cars at breakneck speeds, saving their lives? For a peasant carrying a pot of coals, The adrenaline rush was no less intense than for those drivers. His heart was pounding, his breathing was ragged, and his eyes were watering from the cold and flying ash. It was the most important courier delivery one could possibly imagine. When the messenger returned home, the borrowed coals were immediately placed in the prepared hearth. The driest kindling and birch bark were laid on top, and they began to blow on it carefully and rhythmically. The whole family stood around, holding their breath and watching the process of revival. When the first flicker of flame appeared, people literally wept with relief. This tradition of sharing fire created strong social bonds within the community. The fire literally became communal, flowing from one hut to another throughout the winter. The physical warmth of neighbors heated your home in the truest sense of the word. In conditions of extreme survival, individualism was a luxury that led to death. In some villages, there was even a single permanent, unquenchable fire in the center of the settlement. It was maintained by the entire community specifically for such emergencies when a household fire was lost. It was the prototype of modern emergency services, created out of sheer enthusiasm and fear. The village protected itself as a single organism, guarding its warm heart. It's funny that today we can transfer money to a neighbor's phone in a couple of seconds. But 1,000 years ago, the most valuable transfer was a handful of glowing wood in a leaky pot. Technology has changed, but the need for support from those around us in times of trouble remains the same. Fire was simply the ancient currency of this mutual aid. But what if you lived on a remote farmstead with no neighbors nearby? Or if a fierce blizzard had buried all the roads, making it impossible to leave the house? In such situations, a dying fire ceased to be a mere household problem and became a death sentence. It was the moment when people realized they had almost no chance of surviving until spring. Without a fire, the temperature inside the house would equal that outside in just a few merciless hours. Water in buckets would freeze, walls would frost over from the inside, and breath would turn to steam. People put on everything they had, huddled together on the bed, and tried to keep each other warm. They pulled the animals close, forming a single mass of desperately shivering bodies. Losing the fire in winter meant not only freezing, but also losing the ability to eat. Frozen grain and icy meat could not be cooked without heat treatment. Even if you had barns full of food, you could starve to death surrounded by supplies. Fire was the key that unlocked the calories necessary for the body to function. In such cases, the head of the family would make a last, desperate attempt to produce a spark. They would strike flint against a tinderbox until their hands were rubbed raw and bleeding. They would use the driest scraps of clothing, their hair, and even bird nests found under the roof. It was a true gladiatorial battle against an invisible but merciless enemy in the form of the cold. If a spark never appeared, a terrifying, ringing silence of resignation would descend. People's metabolism slowed, and they were overcome by a sleep that seemed warm and cozy. Modern medicine knows that this is a sign of severe hypothermia, when the brain shuts down its defense systems. A person simply fell asleep, never to wake up in this world again. Archaeologists often find the remains of isolated dwellings where entire families perished in exactly this way. Untouched food supplies lie around them, but there are no recent traces of ash in the hearth. These grim discoveries serve as a silent reminder of the fragility of human life in the past. Nature showed no mercy to those who could not keep their flame alive. The fear of such a death shaped the entire way of life in medieval society. People feared darkness and cold on a genetic level, passing this fear down from generation to generation. This terror was reflected in the fairy tales, myths, and legends of all European peoples. Evil always came with the frost, while good was always associated with the warm light of the hearth. We often idealize the past, imagining knights and beautiful ladies in castles. But the real history of Europe is the story of a peasant blowing on smoldering coals with trembling lips. Their heroism lay not in sword fights, but in the daily victory over freezing, and their main weapon was a simple pile of burning rubbish. That is why the punishment for deliberately extinguishing someone else's fire was incredibly severe. In some ancient laws, it was equated with attempted murder, with all that entailed. To leave a person without fire in winter meant condemning them to a painful death. The law protected the right to warmth just as strictly as the right to life itself. And every time they managed to rekindle the fire, it was celebrated as a small miracle. The house was once again filled with light, the smell of food, and that irritating but oh-so-salvific smoke. Disaster took a step back, retreating to a dark corner of the hut until the next long night. The battle had been won, but the war against winter raged on. Ultimately, maintaining a single communal fire was not merely a technical task. It was the greatest social glue, uniting people more strongly than any oaths or laws. It is impossible to hate a person with whom you share the last bit of warmth on a freezing night. The hearth compelled peace, cooperation, and unconditional forgiveness within the hut. Egoists simply did not survive in such conditions because the loner froze first. The system selected those who knew how to negotiate, give up their place by the fire, and share firewood. Social ties became literally a matter of physical survival in the harsh climate. You depended on your neighbors just as much as they depended on you. When spring finally arrived and the snow began to melt, the village was transformed. The doors of the huts opened, the smoky confinement ended, and people stepped out into the sunlight. But they emerged as different people, united by months of struggle for a shared flame. Winter had forged them into a single organism that had passed the test of endurance. Today we sit in isolated apartments with individual radiators. We don't need to ask our neighbors for coal or share night watch duties with them. Our independence has come at the cost of comfort, but at the same time we've lost that wild sense of unity. We no longer need a shared hearth to survive the winter. We have shifted the responsibility for warmth onto soulless pipes and power plants. Fire has ceased to be a deity at the center of the room and has turned into a line item on a utility bill. This is a tremendous advancement that has saved millions of lives from freezing and suffocation by smoke. But sometimes it is useful to remember the price our ancestors paid for this warmth. Every radiator turned on is the result of a 1,000-year evolution of the struggle against the cold. Modern technologies seem like magic, but they grew out of that very same soot-stained pot of coals. We have conquered winter, transforming it from a deadly threat into a time for ski trips. But the genetic memory of that fear still lives somewhere deep within us. The next time you turn on a heater, just take a second to think about that. Think of the person who ran through a blizzard with a handful of coals to save their family, of those who stayed up all night, shoveling ashes with hands frozen and rubbed raw, and of those for whom losing the fire meant losing the chance to survive until spring. The history of survival is not just about great battles and the fall of empires. It is the daily quiet heroism of ordinary people fighting for every degree Celsius in their huts. Their victories were not recorded in chronicles. They were measured by the number of winters they survived. And their greatest monument is the fact that you and I are alive today. They kept this flame alive, passing it down through the centuries, from generation to generation. This communal fire, around which they slept, cooked food, and simply tried to survive. Smoky, toxic, yet such an infinitely desired and life-saving source of warmth. The most important fire in human history. And that is truly remarkable. Not the largest army, not the best weapons, but simply the ability to keep warm saved entire villages from total extinction. Here is a story about how a single pile of burning branches determined the fate of entire generations. Fire truly was the main focal point for the whole family on long winter evenings. Without that life-saving handful of embers, surviving in a simple peasant home was completely impossible. It sounds crazy to a modern person, but that was their only reality. Today, we've grown too quickly accustomed to the comfort of central heating and warm radiators all year round. Our ancestors viewed simple warmth as the greatest treasure and a reward for their hard labor. They had to fight daily for every degree in their modest, cramped homes. The next time you feel that winter is too harsh, just remember the nightly watch by the medieval hearth. Think about the people of the past and their incredible resilience in the face of a merciless nature. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.